The interrogation chamber reeked of burned flesh and sterilized metal, a contrast of brutality and precision that defined the Galactic Empire's methods. The woman hung limp in the restraints, her once white prison dress soaked in crimson, her breath shallow but steady. The Empire had broken countless species before, bending them under the weight of its technological superiority. Yet this human refused to yield. Commander Varric loomed over her, frustration etched into his reptilian features. His species, the Tyrak, prided themselves on their ability to extract confessions with scientific efficiency. Humans, however, had proven uniquely resistant. This one, in particular, had defied every expectation. His orders were clear: break her, extract intelligence on the Resistance's operations, then dispose of her as a message to the rest. He had underestimated her resolve. She lifted her head, blood trailing from the corner of her mouth, and smiled. It was a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but it sent a ripple of unease through the room. Varric's subordinates, hardened executioners, had witnessed creatures beg, scream, and break. They had never seen one smile at the brink of death. Miles away, deep within the ruins of the colony's industrial sector, her husband sat motionless in a sniper's nest, his rifle barrel extending through a narrow gap in the collapsed infrastructure. The Empire had seized the world 6 months ago, forcing its people into servitude or extinction. Resistance cells formed in the shadows, led by men who had nothing left to lose. He was one of them, a veteran of Earth's wars, a man who had watched his world burn one piece at a time. His team monitored the transmissions from the interrogation chamber, listening to her labored breaths. His grip tightened around the rifle's grip as Varric spoke. "You think your silence matters?" The commander's voice was thick with contempt. "You think your kind's defiance is anything more than an inconvenience? The Empire does not tolerate resistance. You will die here, and the only legacy you leave behind is a lesson to the rest of your species." She met his gaze, unwavering. "Then you've already lost." Varric's patience snapped. He signaled the guards. One of them stepped forward, a shock baton crackling with energy. The sniper's finger tensed against the trigger. His spotter, a seasoned operator crouched beside him, whispered, "Not yet." He wanted to pull the trigger. He wanted to end Varric's miserable existence, but it wouldn't save her. The chamber was deep within the Empire stronghold, layers of defenses between her and any possible escape. A sniper's bullet was a scalpel, not a hammer. Precision would come later. The baton struck. The woman's body arched, muscles convulsing as electricity tore through her nervous system. The only sound she made was a sharp intake of breath. No screams. No surrender. The guard hesitated, unnerved. Varric growled. Again. The strikes continued, methodical and cruel. She endured, refusing them the satisfaction of her pain. In the sniper's nest, a clenched fist trembled. The resistance team exchanged glances. "She's buying us time," one of them murmured. The leader closed his eyes, forcing himself to breathe. His wife was a warrior, a strategist. She had known the risks. If she was enduring, it meant she had faith in their plan. He couldn't fail her now. Back in the chamber, Varric finally exhaled in exasperation. "You humans, always making this difficult." He motioned to the executioner droids stationed at the room's edge. "If pain will not break you, death will." The droid stepped forward, energy rifles humming to life. The resistance team heard the words through their earpieces. "She's out of time." The sniper exhaled slowly. "We stick to the plan." The droids raised their weapons. The woman straightened her posture, shoulders squared. "You're making a mistake." Varric sneered. "I think not." The shots echoed through the chamber. The sniper forced himself to remain still. He heard the impact, the thud of her body hitting the floor. The monitors in their hideout went silent. A long breath escaped through his nose. His spotter's voice was quiet. "We move at nightfall." The resistance fighters dispersed, steel in their spines, fire in their hearts. The Empire had taken one of their own, believing it to be the end. They didn't realize they had just started a war. The Empire's execution had been swift, methodical. The droids fired in unison, their energy rounds tearing through flesh and bone with calculated precision. The woman collapsed, blood pooling beneath her motionless form. Commander Varric had watched with the cold satisfaction of a man who believed himself victorious. A wasted life, he had thought. Humans clung to defiance as if it were armor, but defiance alone never stopped the inevitable. He had turned away, issuing orders to dispose of the body. The resistance would find out soon enough what happened to those who opposed imperial rule. Her body had been discarded in the wastelands beyond the city, a desolate stretch of scorched rock and shifting sands, where no creature lingered for long. The execution detail left her there, a forgotten remnant of rebellion, unworthy of burial or thought. By the time the transport's thrusters kicked up dust and the soldiers departed, the night had fully descended, wrapping the world in silence. And then, 40 minutes later, her fingers twitched. A ragged breath tore through her throat as consciousness flooded back in a sudden, violent surge. The pain was immediate and absolute, a raw, searing agony coursing through her body. Her lungs burned, her muscles trembled, and for a moment she could not tell if she was still dying or if death itself had rejected her. Memories fragmented and reassembled. The interrogation chamber, the beatings, the moment of execution, the darkness that followed. But she was not dead. She rolled onto her side, pain lancing through every nerve as she gasped, fingers clawing at the ground. The wounds were still there, the seared flesh, the ragged holes in her torso where the energy blasts had torn through. But they were closing. She could feel it. Muscle knitting together, cells regenerating at an impossible rate. The agony was unbearable, but beneath it was something else, power, raw and unfamiliar. She pressed a trembling hand against her ribs, where she knew there had been a wound. The skin was whole. The pain was real, but it was fading. Somewhere in the ruins of the city, her husband and his team moved with disciplined precision, slipping through the underbelly of the occupied zone. The plan had changed. It was no longer about extracting intelligence or sabotaging supply lines. It was war. The moment the execution was confirmed, the mission had shifted to retaliation. They would make the Empire bleed for what it had done. They had no idea she was still breathing. With each passing moment, her strength returned, the searing pain giving way to something deeper, something terrifyingly potent. She pushed herself upright, her breath steadying. The Empire thought it had crushed her, but something had changed. The execution had not ended her. It had awakened her. Her mind sharpened as instincts settled into place. The desert stretched endlessly around her, but she was not lost. She knew where she needed to go. The city was a graveyard of occupied streets, patrolled by soldiers who believed themselves invincible. The resistance had spent months learning the patterns of their movements, memorizing every weakness. She had studied it alongside them. She was not returning as a fugitive. She was returning as a hunter. The march back was relentless. The barren wasteland had never been forgiving, but her body adapted, enduring the torment of torn muscles and aching bones. She was no stranger to hardship. Pain had been her companion long before the Empire came. But now it was something different, something she could control. By the time she reached the city's perimeter, the night was deep, shadows stretching over the ruined structures like silent sentinels. The guards posted at the outer wall were lazy in their patrols, their confidence built on the belief that no human would dare approach, let alone one they had executed. She watched, movements calculated, her mind working through every scenario. The old rules no longer applied. She had spent her life fighting wars by human standards. Strike fast, strike hard, disappear before the enemy could react. But now she understood that she was no longer bound by those limitations. Her hands flexed, a phantom pulse of energy coursing through her veins. The Empire had broken her body, but in doing so, they had forged something stronger. She did not know why she had returned from death, nor did she care. The only thing that mattered now was what came next. As she scaled the ruined scaffolding of a collapsed building, slipping past the guards with silent efficiency, she could hear the distant hum of comms chatter from an Imperial outpost. The resistance was on the move. The execution had been a message, but it had only hardened their resolve. They would strike before dawn. She reached the top of the structure, eyes scanning the streets below. In the distance, she saw the flicker of movement, her husband's team, slipping through the abandoned industrial sector, preparing for the assault. He didn't know she was alive. Not yet. But soon he would. Because she wasn't just coming back. She was coming for them all. The first enemy never saw her coming. He barely had time to register the shadow moving in the periphery of his vision before her hands wrapped around his helmeted head, twisting with brutal precision. The crack of vertebrae was muffled by the wind, his body slumping forward as she lowered him silently to the ground. The weight of his rifle settled easily in her grip, the familiarity of a weapon in her hands grounding her in the reality of what she was about to do. She had no plan beyond this moment, no strategy beyond the hunt. The Empire had taken everything from her, and now she would take everything from them. Her husband's team was moving through the city's underbelly, unaware of her approach. Their comms were silent, their movements disciplined, but she had spent years at their side. She knew the paths they would take, the choices they would make. Every instinct told her to reveal herself, to make contact, but the part of her that had been reborn in the wasteland demanded patience. She was different now, changed, and until she understood what that meant, she couldn't risk exposing them to whatever she had become. The night was alive with tension, the distant hum of Imperial patrols blending with the low murmur of resistance fighters slipping through the ruins. The Empire believed itself untouchable within these walls, its grip tightening with each passing day. But it was not prepared for what was coming. She moved through the alleyways with inhuman speed, her senses heightened, her breath steady despite the burning fury simmering just beneath her skin. Every fiber of her being screamed for vengeance, but she forced herself to wait, to watch, to learn. Her husband was close now. She could see him in the distance, his team gathering at a rendezvous point near the industrial sector. The plan was clear. Hit the main barracks, eliminate key targets, and disappear before reinforcements arrived. It was a mission designed to send a message, a warning that the resistance was still alive, still fighting. But she knew better. The Empire didn't fear warnings. It only feared annihilation. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of ozone and burning metal. A patrol was approaching, their armored boots striking against the cracked pavement with mechanical precision. For soldiers, heavily armed, their visors scanning the darkness. She could hear the static of their comms, the faint exchange of orders. They were moving toward her husband's team. They didn't know it, but they were already dead. She stepped from the shadows before they could react. The first shot tore through the nearest soldier's throat, the blast of stolen Imperial plasma burning through his armor as he staggered backward, choking on his own blood. The second turned, raising his weapon, but she was faster. Her body moved with an efficiency that defied human limits, closing the distance before he could pull the trigger. Her fist caved in his helmet, the reinforced material cracking like glass beneath the force of the blow. The remaining two had no time to process what they were seeing. One fell to his knees, scrambling to raise his rifle, but she was already on him. The butt of her stolen weapon slammed into his visor, shattering the optics before she wrenched his head back and drove a knife through the exposed gap beneath his jaw. The last soldier tried to run, He made it 2 steps before a shot punched through his spine, dropping him lifelessly to the ground. She exhaled, the silence settling around her like a second skin. The battle had lasted seconds, but her heartbeat remained steady, her body barely registering the exertion. The power coursing through her veins felt limitless, terrifying in its intensity. She should have been exhausted. She should have felt something. But all she felt was the need to keep moving. The distant sound of approaching footsteps pulled her from the moment. Her husband's team had heard the fight. They were coming. She turned toward the rooftop of a collapsed structure, scaling the jagged remains of metal and concrete with ease, her movements silent as she perched above the alleyway. Below, her husband emerged, rifle raised, his expression unreadable beneath the shadows. His voice was low, edged with tension. Bodies. 4 of them. Another man crouched beside the fallen patrol, turning one of them over. Close-range kills. Someone got to them first. She could see the calculation in her husband's stance, the way his grip on his rifle tightened. He knew. Maybe not everything, but enough to sense something was wrong. He was a hunter, just like her, trained to recognize the unnatural when he saw it. He scanned the rooftops, the alleyways, searching for the ghost that had torn through an Imperial patrol without a sound. For a moment, she almost stepped forward, almost let him see her. But the words caught in her throat. She didn't know how to explain what had happened, didn't know how to tell him that the woman he had buried was standing above him, watching, waiting for something she couldn't name. One of the men beside him adjusted his grip on his weapon. Whoever did this isn't our enemy. Her husband didn't answer. His gaze lingered on the shadows for a moment longer before he signaled the team forward. They had a mission to complete, and whatever had killed these soldiers wasn't their priority. Not yet. She remained still as they moved on, disappearing into the night. The city was still filled with enemies, and their fight was far from over. But she was no longer just another soldier in this war. She was something else now. Something the Empire had created without realizing the consequences. And soon, it would regret ever laying a hand on her. The war zone was alive with the echoes of distant gunfire, the rhythmic pulse of explosions carving deep into the city's metallic husk. Above, the sky was thick with the distant glow of Imperial warships, their engines casting eerie shadows over the ruined landscape. The streets were littered with debris, bodies left to rot where they had fallen, and the acrid scent of burnt flesh mixed with the metallic tang of ozone. She moved through the chaos like a ghost, unseen, untouched, her presence more rumor than reality. The enemy was hunting for her, but they didn't understand what they were chasing. Her husband was closing in, his team pushing deeper into the Imperial stronghold. Their movements were precise, methodical, the kind of coordination that only came from years of fighting together. But they didn't realize they weren't alone. She had been following them for hours, watching from the edges of battle, ensuring that nothing reached them before she did. The Empire had taken her apart, shattered her piece by piece, but they had made a mistake. They had failed to keep her dead. A group of Imperial soldiers swept through the alleyways ahead, their visors glowing in the darkness, weapons raised. She could hear the chatter over their comms, the growing unease in their voices. They knew something was wrong. They had heard the stories, the whispers of a human that refused to stay buried. Some dismissed it as superstition, but others had seen the aftermath. They had found the bodies of their comrades, torn apart with inhuman efficiency. She descended upon them with the silence of death itself. The first never had the chance to scream. A blade sliced through his throat, arterial spray catching the dim light as his body crumpled to the ground. The second turned, plasma rifle rising, but she was already inside his guard. Her fingers crushed his windpipe, his final breath a strangled gasp as he fell. The last 2 broke formation, one backpedaling in terror, the other screaming into his comms for backup. It wouldn't matter. She moved faster than their eyes could follow, closing the distance in a blur of motion. One went down with a shattered ribcage, the other with his spine twisted at an impossible angle. She exhaled slowly, forcing herself to focus, The kills had been effortless. Too effortless. Her body responded to the violence with a cold efficiency that felt foreign, unnatural. She should have felt exhaustion, fear, something. But there was only the drive to keep going, to finish what the Empire had started. Her husband's team was just ahead now, moving toward the Central Command bunker, the heart of the Imperial occupation. It was heavily fortified, surrounded by automated turrets and squads of elite guards. A direct assault would be suicide. They needed an opening. They needed something to shift the battle in their favor. She would be that opening. Scaling the ruined structures was almost instinctive, her limbs propelling her forward with a strength that defied reason. She reached the upper levels, overlooking the courtyard below. Dozens of soldiers stood in formation, unaware of the predator watching them from above. She gripped the rifle she had taken earlier, steadying her breath. One shot. That was all it would take to set the entire garrison into chaos. The first shot punched through the skull of an officer, his body collapsing in a heap. The soldiers reacted instantly, scrambling for cover, barking orders into their comms. The second shot took out a communications array, cutting off their ability to call for reinforcements. By the time the third soldier fell, the entire outpost was in disarray. That was the cue. Her husband's team struck with precision, emerging from the shadows with lethal force. Gunfire erupted from every direction, the resistance fighters carving through the unprepared Imperial forces. She moved alongside them, never revealing herself, but ensuring that any enemy who flanked them never lived long enough to fire a shot. Her husband was relentless, a force of nature cutting through the battlefield with practiced efficiency. She had always admired that about him, his ability to command, to lead, to adapt. Even now, when the odds were impossible, he fought like a man who refused to accept defeat. She wanted to tell him she was there, that she had never truly left. But the words wouldn't come. Not yet. The fight dragged on, but the tide had turned. The Empire's forces were breaking, their formations crumbling under the assault. Explosions rocked the compound as the resistance planted charges, setting the entire installation ablaze. It was over. She stood in the aftermath, watching as her husband surveyed the destruction. His shoulders were tense, his grip on his weapon tight. She could see the exhaustion in his stance, the weight of loss pressing down on him. He thought he had buried her, thought he had lost her forever. Stepping into the light, she let herself be seen. His rifle snapped up, instinct driving his reaction. Then he froze. Recognition dawned in his eyes, followed by something deeper. Disbelief. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to explain what had happened to her. But she didn't need to. His grip on the rifle loosened, his breath catching. And in that moment, nothing else mattered.